Please be seated. Good to be with you in worship this morning. Welcome again to you. If you're guests with us especially, I welcome you. So does God speak to us today? Does God speak today? Little did I know when I planned the sermon for today that this very issue would be in the news this week. On this past Wednesday, there was an article. In fact, there were articles and videos everywhere about this issue. Jesse Duplantis, a television evangelist in Louisiana, said that God spoke to him and told him that he needed a $54 million luxury jet with 19 seats and optional shower, as a matter of fact. God spoke to him, he said, and told him about that. And then he already had 3 jets, but he needed a 4th in order to spread the gospel. He's not the only one, as a matter of fact, to announce this. There's another television evangelist I had not heard of, but it's hard to make these things up. His last name is Dollar. I'm not joking. Who also said God told him he needed a $65 million luxury jet in order to spread the gospel. And here locally, Kenneth Copeland out on Eagle Mountain Lake has a compound out there and a private airport and a $36 million Gulfstream luxury jet. Duplantis and Copeland appeared in a video together in which they were talking about this need, and Kenneth Copeland said that it's absolutely necessary that if it weren't for the private jet, he would have to give up 75, 85, even 90% of the things he does. And he said it's just impossible to get from here to there, he said, otherwise. He said it's being in a long metal tube with a bunch of demons. And it's life-threatening, he said. Now, I know commercial flight can be trying, but really? Now, we chuckle at that a little bit. We don't, and we're uncomfortable at the same time, and we don't quite know how to handle that because it reflects very poorly on the church. It reflects poorly on Christians and on clergy, for that matter. So does God speak to us today? And do we believe that God told those evangelists they needed those jets to spread the gospel? Duplantis said that if Jesus were alive on earth today, that Jesus would not ride a donkey, but he would fly in a jet to spread the good news. That is one of the most astoundingly ridiculous statements I've heard in a long time. So does God speak to us today? We hear that, and it's hard for me to imagine that anyone believes that God told them those things. So does God speak today? That's really the question. This past week, there was another story on the program Think on NPR. This was on Wednesday. An interview with an author who wrote an article for Harper's Magazine, the current issue, about how healthy people hear voices. I was intrigued with that story. I remember years ago speaking with a member of the church I was serving at that time. This is years ago in another church, who shared with me that she suffered from schizophrenia. And it was the first time, in fact, really the only time I've talked to anyone for a long time in depth about what that experience is like. And she told me that she hears voices all the time. And I asked her, are you hearing voices right now as we're speaking? And she said, yes. And she said that she had medication that dampened them just a little bit. And I asked her, are they kind voices? And she said, oh, no, they're mean voices. How do you live with that? She said, I've just had to learn to deal with it. And she said, they sound as real as your voice sounds right now. But she has learned somehow to cope with that terrible illness. But this program was about how healthy people also hear voices sometimes. It was a fascinating program because the author had done extensive research and had read many papers, had looked at all kinds of studies, had interviewed many people through the years, or through the last couple of years, about their experiences. And she discovered that in one way or the other, in one form or another, many people will say that they hear voices. And sometimes they're very audible voices. I'm sorry, purely coincidental. Where was I? Sometimes they're voices that are just as audible as if they're in the same room. Oh, come on, folks. Let's move on. Settle down. Sometimes there are audible voices. One person in her study said, yeah, I was driving along one day and God spoke to me from the back seat of the car and said, I will always be with you. And it was so real and audible to her that she pulled over and turned around to see what was going on. A lot of times it's in that state between sleeping and waking that people hear those voices. One study said that 40% of the adults in that study, and it was a large study, she said, she didn't say the exact number, but she said thousands of adults were interviewed, and 40% said in that state between waking and sleeping, on the cusp of sleep, on the cusp of waking, that people, 40% reported hearing a voice. Often the voice of a loved one that had passed away. Sometimes a voice they understood to be the voice of God. I experienced that one time. I was in that state on the cusp of sleep, and I heard my brother's voice call my name. Loudly, like from the next room it sounded like. And I snapped away. Maybe you've had some kind of experience like that. Most often when people say that they've heard God speaking to them, though, it's in that in-between state, or it is an impression or a strong feeling or something that they would describe as like a voice or almost like a voice, where they felt very strongly that God had a word for them. And as we heard a moment ago when Mr. Mark told the story, that was the experience that Samuel had. In that state of sort of maybe asleep, maybe awake, on the cusp of sleep, and he hears the voice 3 times, and it ends up that Eli, the priest in the temple there at Shiloh, realizes something else is going on here, and so Eli gives him some good advice. To go and to lie down and to listen, and if the voice speaks again, to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." To respond, to lie down and to listen and to respond. And as I thought about that story for us today, and this whole matter of God speaking to us today, I think this story has a word for us. We can think of Eli's advice as our advice. To lie down, that is somehow to give up control. That's hard to do. To lie down and to let go a bit of our need to control everything. To lie down, to get still, and to be silent. And that's hard to do too. Soren Kierkegaard, almost 300 years ago, said that if he could write one prescription for the world's ills, it would be silence. Now that was almost 300 years ago. Not much noise 300 years ago compared to our world today. We need silence. Go and lie down, Eli said to Samuel, and he did. And he listened, and that was the second piece, to listen, to pay attention. That's a hard thing to do too. And for some of us, harder than others. I actually was diagnosed with this malady not long after we got married. A few years ago, I told you this story. Susan and I had been married not very long, and she became convinced that I had a hearing problem. And so she finally convinced me to go to the doctor and to have that checked, and I did. And the doctor said, your hearing's actually above average. So why are you here? Well, my wife, told me that she believed I had a hearing problem, and I explained this. And he looked at me with a little smile and he said, you don't have a hearing problem, you've got a listening problem. And Susan will testify that there is no medication that cures that, and there was nothing he could do, and that is an issue that I've had all of my life. My daughters give me a hard time about this. Growing up, they would say, Dad, 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 Tim. And finally, I would pay attention to what they had to say. Listening. How do we listen for God's voice? Well, we can't sort of make that happen, but we listen by being attuned to one another. We listen by being attuned to that stillness and that silence, where maybe God would have a thought for us that would come into our heads. We listen for that voice of God in one another. It occurred to me this week as I was thinking about this, that Jesus taught that we actually experience and we see the Lord in those who Jesus called the least of these, my brothers and sisters. And what he meant by that was not that they're less important, but the ones who are most in need. Those who are thirsty and hungry and in need of clothing, and those who are sick, those who are strangers and need to be welcomed, and those who are in prison and need to be visited. When you do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, Jesus said, you do it to me. To listen for God speaking today is to listen to those who are in need as well. It's in their voices that we hear the voice of God speaking quite often. Identifying with the needs, understanding the needs, hearing the call of God on our lives. So what do those who are strangers and need to be welcomed have to say to us? Is God speaking in them? What about those who are hungry and need a meal, who need sustenance, who need a way of feeding themselves? Does God speak to us through them? Those who don't have adequate clothing or shelter, those who are sick, those who are in prison, all of those Jesus named. One of the tests of whether it's God speaking or not is whether it is consistent with the teaching of Jesus and the life of Jesus. When we believe that God has a word for us and may be speaking to us, we have to test it. Is it consistent with love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself? Is it consistent with the life and teaching of Jesus and what he cared about and what he called his disciples and you and me to care about? Is it consistent with the love of God and that love that we see most perfectly lived out and taught in Jesus? We have to test those words. When someone says, God spoke to me, I always take that initially very skeptically. I want to know, is it tested? Is it consistent with everything we know about God and what God would say to us today? So that question, does God speak to us today? I believe the answer is yes. In ways that sometimes go beyond our understanding. And quite often in ways that if we stop and we pay attention and we listen are really quite mundane and messages that we ought to be hearing along the way. Years ago, when Bishop Joe Wilson retired, he gave me a prayer kneeler, and it's up in a study that I have up on the 3rd floor that no one goes to. It's just a place where I can get away and can study and can leave books and papers out and so forth. But this kneeler, when he gave it to me, if you all, some of you know Bishop Joe Wilson, you know his sense of humor. And so when he gave it to me, he said, "Here, take this. The thing never worked for me." And so I said, "Well, Bishop, you have to use it, for it to work." I saw him a month ago at a meeting, and so I said, "You remember that kneeler you gave me?" And I said, "It doesn't work for me either, Bishop, but actually it only does work if you use it." And above that kneeler is this hymn that I put there to remind me that prayer is not just about talking and the words we use. It is about listening as well and trying to discern what God would say to us today. And I want to read these words to you as I close my time. Lord, speak to me that I may speak in living echoes of thy tone. As thou hast sought, so let me seek the erring children lost and lone. Oh, teach me, Lord, that I may teach the precious things thou dost impart, and wing my words that they may reach the hidden depths of many a heart. Oh, give thine own sweet rest to me, that I may speak with soothing power a word in season as from thee to weary ones in needful hour. Oh, fill me with thy fullness, Lord, until my very heart o'erflow, in kindling thought and glowing word, thy love to tell, thy praise to show. Oh, use me, Lord, use even me, just as thou wilt, and when and where, until thy blessed face I see, thy rest, thy joy, thy glory share. Amen.